Welcome everyone to our panel, Getting Asia In, Asia's Role in Global Security Challenges. With the various crises in Europe, Europe's immediate neighborhood, it is often debated that Asia is of lesser relevance for our foreign policy. So today, we do not only want to talk about security in Asia, but more about security matters to be discussed with Asia. Our interests, especially with India and China, increasingly overlap, and it is time to bring the security discourses together. We want to ask whether Europe is ready and willing to actively engage with China and India to address issues such as terrorism and state failure. What are the security perceptions of China and India, and what are the respective expectations against the background of potential US disengagement? We're delighted to welcome for this discussion Mr. Niels Annen, member of the German Bundestag, and also chairman of the South Asia Parliamentary Group. His Excellency Subrahmanyam Jaishankar, Foreign Secretary in the Ministry of External Affairs in India. He's one of the most influential voices on foreign policy in India, and we're very, very delighted to have him here. Ms. Susan Thornton, who currently serves as the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for East Asian and Pacific Affairs in the US Department of State and is a China hand. And last but certainly not least, Major General Yunzhu. She's Director Emeritus of the Center on China-American Defense Relations at the Academy of Military Science of the Chinese People's Liberation Army in Beijing. The panel will be moderated by Niblett, Director of Chatham House in London. And I would ask you all now to join me on stage. Please.
Thank you, Anke. Thank you very much. And I'm delighted to have this opportunity to chair this panel, which, as Anke noted, is taking a slightly different angle on the issue of Asia and security. Getting Asia In is the subtitle, Asia's Role in Global Security Challenges. And I think we've got, if I may say, two people representing Asia on the panel. And two people representing governments that may want to see Asia involved more in global security, or maybe not. And we can discuss those issues now. And I wanted to start off because I think it's pretty important if in today's world where there's growing lack of interest perhaps in intervening inside other countries' policies. There's a desire to try and look more for practical and realistic cooperation. If we're going to explore this idea of getting Asia in, we better make sure that we have a similar list of priorities, of key concerns. Because if it turns out that the global security agenda looks very different in Washington to how it looks in Beijing, or in Berlin to how it looks in New Delhi, then it's going to be very difficult to find bridges between Asia and Europe and the United States in facing global security. And so let me just, I think simplest is to go down the list very quickly and just ask you to give no more than 2 minutes at the most of where you would put, what you would put at the top of your list of global security challenges. I'm not talking here about specific future of Syria or Iraq, in your case, Susan, but more if you were thinking about global order, global security, what do you think the United States today structurally, and I suppose in the next year or two, would likely put at the top of its list of global security challenges?
I think any place where you see seams developing in the nation-state system, and you have the rise of individuals and groups, non-state actors. So terrorism, I would put in this category. Also, governance of the global commons and transnational crime, cyber problems, cyber threats, and also pandemic and environmental challenges, I think would be at the top. And I think also just sort of getting consensus on rules-based governance of these commons that are so important to all of our economies, our governments, and our societies and peoples.
And when you say rules-based governance, of these systems, how do you think the US kind of conceives of rules-based governance? Is it UN-led rules-based, or is it, it might be multilateral cooperation, but around a set of norms?
Yeah, no, I think it has to be both. I think we have to work on best practices. A lot of these areas are brand new. New technologies are posing new challenges every day. A lot of these things haven't been worked on, and they're going to pose serious dangers, I think, very soon. And I think if we're not working together either in the UN, but if that's too cumbersome a format, we have lots of other formats, and we need to be flexible.
Thank you. I mean, Niels, let me come straight to you then. Would you have a similar sort of top 3 broad list of global security challenges from a German perspective?
Yeah, well, I would agree basically on the threats described, what you said. But I think it's important to understand from our point of view. I mean, in Europe, Germany certainly is an important country with a robust economy, with political stability. But in the global sense, we are a small country. And we have no power projection, also not in the Asia-Pacific region. And we don't aspire to become a military power in that region. And at the same time, our robust growth and wealth is depending on free trade, and it's depending on that rules-based international order that you mentioned. So our experience within the European Union was that working together, strengthening cooperation between states, building that unique European Union, and as you know, Germany is pretty much dedicated towards the United Nations, and not only in a rhetorical sense, but we are contributing with manpower, with financial contribution. So I would say maybe not exactly the order that has been created after the Second World War, because there are new players on the scene, and I think it's only fair that there needs to be a discussion about their ambitions and their voice at the table. I think that's perfectly fine, but my biggest fear is that there will not be an adjusted international rules-based order, but maybe no rules at all. That's what we are seeing in parts of our neighborhood. And so I want to point to 2 concerns in the Asia-Pacific region. And I think that is, of course, that we see an arms race developing, and that could go out of control. And I am concerned about a new discussion about protectionism. That would hurt our interest, but I'm convinced it will also not contribute to stability.
Okay, so as you put it here, for Germany as a country that needs a framework in a way in which to be involved in global security, the UN has been the preferred framework so far. When you see an arms race building up in the Asia-Pacific, which of course, if it got out of control, could affect Germany's security as economic as well as its security interests. Do you think this is going to pull Germany more into looking for partnerships with other countries to manage the rise of these challenges? Is Germany going to get pulled into a more global security role, do you think, in the next 5 to 10 years? Or is it going to resist?
Well, I mean, that's an interesting question, and it will be a part of a conversation next year. We have a general election coming up, and we already see that after the election of Mr. Trump, we have a little bit the impression that there are so many eyes directed into the direction of Berlin. There are articles in the New York Times describing the chancellor as the last leader of the free world. And look, there are 2 ways to look at this. On the one hand, it's in a way a compliment because it shows that there's trust towards German intentions, and I think that's a result of hard work from generations of Germans and political leaders building that stability, and then we can be a little bit proud of that. But it's also dangerous because we don't have the capacity to jump in to fill whatever room will be left from a future or whatever vacuum we will maybe see in security sense created by a Trump administration, which we don't know yet. And so I'm a little bit afraid that my job in Parliament and our government's job is to do what I think in business English you call expectation management. So we have a clear interest in a stable international cooperation, and that is true for Europe, that is true for NATO. And it's also not a secret that we basically also rely on security guarantees by our American friends that go far into the Pacific theater. And we want to continue this, but at the same time, I think we are ready to share some of the experience that we made here in Europe without preaching anybody, but I think the security structures that we build up could be useful to be discussed in other regions as well. That is a little bit, I think, the basic approach, but don't expect the impossible from Germany. That will lead to disappointment, and it will also lead to maybe an overestimation about what we will be able to provide within that global discussion.
Thank you. Let me come now to you, Subrahmanyam. You have in India, the most populous, I think by now, nation in the world, a prime minister who is much more forward-leaning in a way, at least in India's regional role. But if you had to put the top 2 or 3 things on the global security agenda from an Indian perspective, what would they be in your case?
Well, look, I'd put, without any doubt at all, terrorism as the number 1 issue. And I say this, one, of course, as a country which is being subjected to repeated, sustained terrorist assault, including, by the way, two terrorist attacks which happened earlier this morning. But it is an issue which is very troubling for a variety of reasons. One, the perspectives in Europe on this issue are very different from the perspectives in Asia.
How?
Well, I think a lot of it in Europe is seen as very Middle East centered, linked to actually the collapse of the state, to migration, outflows, whereas what we are seeing, and I'll complete that because I would also say within Asia there's a big difference between East Asia, Southeast Asia, and South Asia. So what we see in South Asia is actually the use of it by a state as a policy. It has nothing to do with the collapse of state authority. Actually, it's a conscious use by a state authority. And the problem with terrorism is it's regionally perceived very differently. Yeah. It is, people still use it, think very nationally about terrorism. So when they look at the terrorist problem, it's really, okay, is it going to bite me or is it not? And can I use it or can I not? Countries that pay lip service to condemning terrorism actually often protect it. So I think, it's both the seriousness of the challenge, the complexity of it, the fact that there's such a differentiated response in the world. That is a very big issue. The second, I would say, is climate change. And I would say that because, historically, climate change has been seen as more a developed country issue. What we have been witnessing actually are its consequences, particularly in Asia. I think there's a shift occurring here. We saw that in Paris. Not just in Paris, we've seen it elsewhere, recently in Kigali as well on the HFC issue, which is how do you actually get a more equitable decision-making, policy-making on climate change, and also how do we follow up on issues on climate change? Because everybody agrees on something. When it comes down to the actions, they sort of vote with their feet. The third issue, to me, is the lack of a democratic, representative, global decision-making system. I think the United Nations is anachronistic. Freezing the 1945 world order is untenable. Even if it happens, it only does damage to the United Nations. And today, if we don't have a global response on many issues, it is because the set of people who are taking the decisions are not representative of the capabilities on the ground. So these would be my three big issues.
And let me just follow up quickly right now then on one point with you before I come to Dr. Yao. To what extent do you think leaders in India, or people in India as well, see, let's call it the West, as partners in dealing with those three challenges? You mentioned right from the beginning the perceptions of terrorism may be different, but does that then play through into whether Europeans or Americans can be partners on this front? The relationship with Pakistan, for example, in the American case. And on UN Security Council reform, that's a pretty difficult one to think of the West as really pushing an agenda for reform on. So do you see global security as something that you're going to have to take care of your own security problems at this level, or do you think there's bridges that can be built?
Well, look, on terrorism, I would say that we are working with the West, though, again, there's a differentiated yes. West, understandably. We could be doing more. But again, in defense of the West, I would say it's not only Western countries who are our problem. I think many Asian countries are our problem in dealing with terrorism as well. It is clearly an area where we want to do more. We are willing to sort of set an example. Frankly, my sense is we will all end up doing more because the threat is upon us much more seriously than most of us realize. On the issue of the United Nations, the opposition to the democratization of the UN doesn't come only from the West. I think it also comes from other Security Council members. I think it is something which we need to all reflect on.
We'll come to in a minute ways around these impasses because they're not going to be fixed in the next 2 to 3 years. But it's very good to have that opening perspective. Yao Yunzhu, if I can come to you first on this topic of how do you think China prioritizes global security threats? What would it have the top 2 or the top 3, you think, as it looks out at the global system?
I think China's perspective of the global security is quite in conformity with the previous speakers. The top security issue globally is the proliferation of nuclear weapons. And for China is particularly valid concern, for it has 4 nuclear weapon states as neighbors, and it had been a time that is very hopeful that maybe we could set the nuclear disarmament in motion, but after 8 years of Obama administration, the trend seems to have reversed. So this is number 1 concern, and the second is global terrorism. And China is a victim of terrorism, but it has not been very well recognized by Western countries. For sometimes, the terrorist in one country might be a freedom fighter for the Western countries. So it's a grave concern, but it's also a difficult issue to really cooperate. And the third thing might be the regional chaos, the turmoils that had happened in the last few years. And China is quite global now, and it has global interest, investment, facilities, assets, citizens. There are 120 Chinese tourists over the world every year, last year, and they spent more than $100 billion on their trip. So the regional, sometimes domestic, regional chaos would be very detrimental to the safety of Chinese citizens, the assets, the facilities, and for example, also the source for energy sometimes, yeah.
So you made the comment at the end, in your first one on proliferation. You said after 8 years of the Obama administration, the nuclear situation in your region was worse rather than better. I think a lot of Americans might say, well, because China hasn't been tougher. So one of the tools, if we're going to have a cooperation between Asia and other countries, there will be the question of what tools are seen as being most useful. One of the most prominent tools in the West has been sanctions, economic sanctions. So can you just tell us where do you think China sits on the issue of sanctions as a means of trying to influence the security environment, whether it be in North Korea, it could be in Africa, take your pick. But our impression is that China is very reluctant, and you're shaking your head.
China is very doubtful about the effectiveness of economic sanctions. China has been sanctioned against for a long time, and China survived, and China thrived. And so North Korea has been sanctioned for many, many years. So when the sanctions does not work, and China is the one who gets the blame. So I don't think that, and actually China had complied with the UN, all the terms of the UN sanctions against the DPRK all the time, but still China is blamed for the sanctions not being effective. That's not fair.
But do you think the sanctions worked in the case of the Iran negotiations?
I'm not quite sure. I'm not quite sure, yeah.
And let me just come back, and I'll come back a minute, if I can, to you quickly, Subrahmanyam. Do you think sanctions, where does India sit on the use of economic sanctions as a tool of trying to build up, let's say, an international community's response to global security threats that may be targeted coming from one country?
Look, I don't think the issue is whether in principle sanctions are right or wrong. I can, for example, cite you the sanctions which were imposed on apartheid South Africa, which were successful over a certain period, on which we had huge problems getting Western countries to join up. So it's, I would say it would work in certain situations, it would not work in situations. The efficacy of sanctions is not the issue, the legitimacy of sanctions is the issue. And sanctions are obviously more legitimate when they are imposed by a body which is seen as representative of global opinion, not necessarily a body which is a cabal or a narrower set of interests. So again, we come back, not the sanctions issue in a sense goes back to a more representative world order issue.
Susan, let me come to you then next and sort of try to knit these two sides together. When you think about America's global security interests going forward, is there a sense that inevitably the United States is going to have to find partnerships with the big other players in the world? There was a time when the US, maybe with Europe and like-minded states, let's call it, were able to kind of write the rules of the road, or at least rule the road through power and determination and so on. But if you were to look at a country like India or a country like China, is the United States trying to think of them as partners on global security?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely what we've been doing for the recent period. And take the example which was mentioned. I mentioned the environment, but Secretary mentioned climate change. Climate change is a premier example of where we have gone out and had to seek partnerships with other major countries in the traditional West or developed space. And you know, it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of work, and you have to bring other countries into seeing where their interests can align with yours in order to get them to become a partner in that effort. And we've managed to do it, I think, in a number of other areas. I think the Iran example that you mentioned is one where I think I would argue that in that case, sanctions did have an effect, and it was a positive effect. It was the effect that we were seeking to have. You know, you can't say, I missed the earlier discussion of the Iran deal, but I think we are working on a project, and it is going according to plan, at least as far as the sanctions go. I think one of the things that, you know, we all talk about in the US government is you don't know that sanctions are working until they work. And you know, you also have to look at what other options you're faced with. And it is, I agree with you, a political issue, but it's also, you know, you have to be undertaking some effort to move the ball in the direction that you want it to go in.
And there's been a lot said about cybersecurity, the relationship between China and the United States in particular on the cybersecurity front has been fraught, has been difficult. But have you been able to sense a shift? Because people have also written that there's been, you know, some quite serious negotiations at the highest levels of government between the United States and China. Do you feel there is a bit more of a coming together on this topic, more mutual self-interest, could we say, around which to operate or not?
Well, I think there's a recognition that we each have very big stakes in coming up with some understanding on how we're going to approach governing the space that cyber takes up, the internet, and how important it is to both of our economies and the future of those economies. So I think we've elevated the consciousness around this issue, and we've reached some basic understandings. I think we also both recognize, and I think along with other major cyber players, that there's a lot more work to be done on this issue, but at least we're talking now, and we're sometimes even talking in the same language, which we weren't before. So I think we've made some progress.
And let me bring you in, Niels, and then folks, get some questions ready or some points you want to raise on this, because this panel could go in many directions depending on where you want to take it. Niels, when you listen to the commentary about terrorism being perceived differently in different countries, one country's terrorist is another country's freedom fighter, I mean, can you see this becoming an area of difficulty in the ability of cooperation emerging between Asia and the West? Do you think there's a sense that normative rules of what is good governance or human rights could end up getting in the way of the ability to cooperate on what might be more realistic kind of interests between, let's say, Asia and the West?
Well, look, I believe that problem of definition has always existed. And sometimes also history is changing the view on people who have been regarded as terrorists and later be seen as freedom fighters and vice versa. But I'm not that pessimistic, because somehow, unfortunately, I believe we have a common enemy. So Islamist, extremist terrorism is not limited to a global region. It's not a European phenomena, or it's not exclusively Asian phenomena. And I hope that we will find some common ground. But that is extremely difficult. Also, we agreed not to talk about Syria on this panel, but we can see in the global coalition against ISIS or Daesh, where Germany is a member, how difficult it is to bring other countries in and to develop a coherent strategy. And for us, it's important that as a democratic country, I think we are contributing already. We are contributing with some military efforts that we made, and we are contributing with intelligence and exchange of intelligence, with setting up international structures that have not been there. But I think for our society, it's also very important that we also learn from experiences that we made after 9/11 happened. I think also my American friends will agree in their majority that some of the message were not appropriate and not proportional. So that's a discussion we need to have. And then, of course, I think there will be differences and also some clashes of views, but that's part of the conversation that we need to have. And I think we can contribute. And I think also that German citizens understand that they are also under threat. So it's not our job as politicians to raise fears, but we had a lot of plots also against German targets, and we were lucky to had good intelligence cooperation, good police work, and as I said, also sometimes you need luck, but I think we can find common ground here, for sure.
So who wants to come in on some points about whether you feel Asia is emerging as or Asian countries, we've got two represented on this panel, are emerging as contributors to global security, and if so, are there steps that could be taken to encourage that process more? You know, is this a false dichotomy in a way? Is it really for Western nations to be saying, come and join us, we've known what the rules are, we know what's best? You know, we haven't got a great record, I wouldn't say, in large parts of the world, maybe with ourselves, but not always in exporting stability. Michael, I saw your hands go up. Do introduce yourselves. If we can get 2 or 3 comments in, that would be great.
Michael McFall from Stanford University. So I want us to come back to North Korea. You hinted about it. You said sanctions don't work and don't blame us. But in my opinion, I was just in South Korea 10 days ago. A #1 challenge, if not the first challenge of the Trump administration, will be dealing with North Korea. I heard all the reasons that it doesn't work. Tell us if you're going to contribute to security in Asia, and I would say to the world, and including security of my own country, what's the right way to deal with that security challenge? And everybody, but especially I'm interested in the Chinese perspective.
Dr. Yao, it's a very specific question, and I don't see other hands going up yet. So what would be your answer? What's the right way if sanctions are not the right way? What do you think?
If a country is threatened with, or at least if the country is threatened or the regime is threatened by the very existence of this regime, how can you expect a third party can come and make that regime surrender or accept the, let me finish first. China's objective on the Korean Peninsula is denuclearization, stability and peace. No military force should be used, and the peaceful reunification if it ever happens. So, but China has no intention to have this regime changed. And for the last 20 years, or at least for the last 10 years, China has tried very hard to set up a framework, a negotiating table for the parties, 6 parties, relevant parties to come together. But the United States has had, maybe not explicitly stated, but sometimes very explicitly stated that they do not like this regime. And the Obama administration had adopted a strategy of strategic patience. That is, we would not, a kind of a hands-off strategy that DPRK, the nuclear issue, is for China to handle. And if China does not, if it cannot be dealt with, it's China's business, because we don't want any negotiation, we don't want any contact with this regime. So if the regime is not the counterpart to talk with, so if you only talk to China and force China to do something, I just don't forget, DPRK is a sovereign state. It has a right to decide its own regime, its own policy. It's not at China's disposal to say, you have to do this, you have to do that. And in case it does not do as the other countries' wishes, it's China's fault.
Do you think, therefore, I mean, you think it's the fact that the United States maintains sanctions as well on North Korea, that it would be better if the US somehow just set aside its concerns and actually engaged with the North Korean government? Or is it that the US should give up its security commitment to South Korea? Or what would you propose?
I think the US should be more interactive, should be more engaging with the DPRK.
So why don't you come in, and then I'm going to let Susan come in, because look, I've got another, we'll do a little bit of a North Korea thing here quickly. If you give the mic as well.
My name is Go Myung-hyun from Southern Institute for Policy Studies. Generally, my institute, we are good friends, and then we go way back. So I'm glad to see you here on the podium. So my question is, I would like to take some issues with your explanation that United States hasn't been engaged enough to reach a negotiated outcome to the North Korea's denuclearization problem. I can come up with many examples where North Korea is actually was the party that reneged on the negotiation effort by the United States. The prime example is the Liblett agreement in 2009. Obama, the new administration, new president in the United States, wanted to negotiate with North Korea about the North Korea's nuclear program. And what happened was that basically North Korea, having reached this agreement that North Korea would go back to the spirit of six-party talks, what it did 1 month later was it tested a long-range missile. So it was the fault of the United States. I don't think the United States took any provocative action in that 1 month's time. It shows that the North Korea is engaged in these provocations according to its own agenda, not because it's actually responding to external threats. At the end of the day, what North Korea is most worried about is indifference from the outside world.
The most promising agreement on the Korean Peninsula is reached in 2005, the September 19th agreement.
That's right.
That has been very, very promising, and we are, as we see it, just one step from success. And then right after that agreement, the United States took some actions, sanctioning actions against DPRK, which blew up the agreement.
We're in a bit of a security dilemma here that's going to go backwards and forwards. So I can't let this become a North Korea discussion. Susan, let me bring you in first on this, and then I want to come to Subrahmanyam on the issue actually of Pakistan and India, a nuclear proliferation. But any comments on this? Do you think the US could be doing something differently? Might it? Should it? What's your view?
We've got our policy on North Korea. I think we and the Chinese are basically in agreement that the focus should be on denuclearization, and that's what we've been pursuing. The concerns about regime change in North Korea, what I would say to that is there's a long history here, and this regime has been in place for an awfully long time. And so it seems very strange that this is continually what's raised on their part, the fear of regime change, because the regime has been there for a very, very long time.
It's becoming regal.
Yes. But, the focus is on denuclearization. There are UN Security Council resolutions to this end. There have been a number of agreements that have all, and I agree with you on the Leap Day agreement, was the latest very good faith attempt by this administration to continue negotiations, and
So this is a good example of a topic where it's going to be difficult to find consensus, but partly because this is a neighbor to China. In a way, this is more than a global security challenge. This is a physical, direct security challenge. But Subrahmanyam, the India-Pakistan standoff is often not talked about as much, and yet, in some ways, you have two nuclear-armed states side by side there, different from the South Korea, North Korea situation. Would you welcome greater external involvement in trying to make sure that is a stable environment from a nuclear standpoint? Are you worried that non-proliferation is a dynamic that might also affect further South Asia or not?
Well, we are not the only two nuclear neighbors in the world. She just told you she had 4 neighbors with nuclear weapons. Number two, I think the principal issue between India and Pakistan is not a nuclear issue. But the principal issue is a terrorism issue. When you look at the two, part of the problem is if you look at the way we've approached the issue. Yes, we made nuclear weapons because we felt our security required it. But at the end of the day, our focus is on growing our nuclear power program. And even when we are looking at climate change, one of the conclusions we have drawn is the way France and Japan built up their nuclear programs. Unless India moves to a very heavy reliance on civil nuclear energy, the only alternative is coal, which the rest of the world has, and we have very strong views about. But the thrust of it has been really a power program. We haven't proliferated outside India. I was struck by the North Korea question because one part of the North Korea debate which very conveniently gets left out is where did the North Korean nuclear program come out of? I mean, unless you believe in an immaculate conception in North Korea as well. The fact is that it was a direct result of a proliferating activity. Yeah. And I think it wasn't only China which looked away. I think a lot of other countries, including the United States, looked away at that point of time.
Yeah. Okay, let me bring in some other points here. Some people who haven't had a chance to speak yet. Fraser, then here, then here. Yeah.
Robin Fraser-Cameron, the EU-Asia Centre in Brussels. I think the whole premise of this discussion, if you look at even the title, is how can the Asians contribute to the West? And, Asia's the 2/3 of the world population and not been responsible for the wars of the last, half century. If you look at the American role in Iraq or the proliferation of wars around Europe. So I think we should be a little bit more modest in what we are actually expecting from Asia. And there are some areas where I think we can learn from them. In India, for example, with a huge Muslim population, you've sent, I think, about 25 radical fighters for Daesh. In Belgium, where I live, we've sent 500. So there's something I think we can learn from your approach, as I would say we could learn from Indonesia's approach to multiculturalism that might go down quite well, both in America and in Europe. So I think this should be a bit more of a two-way street about what we can learn from each other. And fundamentally, we have to start addressing our comprehensive approach to security, something that we've put down in the EU's global strategy, which both Mogherini and Ashton at successive Shangri-La conferences have tried to describe. And we should try and see if there's any meeting of minds here in terms of how we approach the comprehensive approach to security, I would call it. Because just picking up individual items like terrorism, we're not going to get very far because we really can only go a certain level and then you lose the trust. So let's have a debate about what are the fundamentals of security rather than think that we can actually solve big issues like terrorism or even North Korea between Asia and Europe. We're not going to do that.
Good. There's a question at the front here somewhere. Yes, the gentleman there. One coming here and here. Yeah.
Thomas Niels with the National Public Radio here. I used to be correspondent in New York, and I watched especially China and India as the two biggest countries in the world. And I still wonder why is it that you don't get involved even more in attempts to solve the problems, to solve real serious conflicts in the world, especially China, because you are a permanent member of Security Council, but also India. I mean, you have your own problems. You mentioned, Mr. Secretary, the terrorism, and I know I've been in your country, Uiguren and Tibet, and I know your rejection to intervene somewhere, but I'm still wondering why these two great and big countries don't get involved more.
Okay, question here at the front.
Dr. Semeny from Ukraine. I have the question to Ms. Thornton and to Ms. Yao because it is connected. We have two elephants in the room if we are tackling Asian Pacific. Both of them are quite important. All of the neighbors are watching at them. And then we come to the question, if we're talking seriously about security, whether both of them do understand each other quite well and do understand some kind of rules of the game or red lines of each of the side. And then the question, for example, to you, Ms. Thornton, do the United States accept some kind of red lines with regard to China, be it bilateral or be it multilateral, not to be crossed with regard to China? And to Mrs. Yao, do China or Chinese accept some kind of red lines with regard to the United States not to be crossed, just be it bilateral ties or be it just in Asia-Pacific region in general?
Okay, like for that, from Iran. Oh yeah, come to you.
Yes, as someone who's been working on economic sanction theoretically and practically, assuming in 2013 you had not Rouhani in office in Tehran and you had Dr. Jalili, which was the competitor of Dr. Rouhani. Can anybody tell us that we would get a nuclear deal at that point? Impossible. Go back 10 years before that. You had the same people there, Rouhani and also Zarif. They accepted a symbolic enrichment and still no resolution, no economic sanction. So we have to rethink about this. And more than that, sometimes you talk about economic efficacy. That might be easy, but when it goes to the political behavior of the system, that is absolutely a different case. Not everybody will see economic vulnerability as a vulnerability. So this is important case when we talk about, nuclear, the effect of economic sanction on different countries.
Thank you. And two more. One, Jack at the back. You've got a microphone of you? Yeah. And lady here, and then we're going to come back to the panel.
Just one final, Jack James from Johns Hopkins in Washington. One final question to our Chinese representative and to Niels. There was an attempt on the part of the Europeans to get engaged in trying to deal with, shall we say, security issues in China, and it was a certain decision in The Hague that was simply dismissed by China. As far as the Europeans trying to use tools for the rules of the road, that didn't work out very well. And I wonder what you thought of that, and I wonder what you think of that, because if there is going to be some common basis for a rules of the road, and one part of that equation basically dismisses its legitimacy, then I think we have a problem in terms of trying to find common denominators.
That's the part that hasn't ratified the treaty, or the part that doesn't accept the ruling?
The part that doesn't accept the ruling.
Just checking which bit. Lady here.
Thank you very much. Lynn Kwok, Brookings Institution. My question is directed to you, Ms. Yao. When we talk about global security challenges, one thing that comes immediately to my mind, perhaps because of my background as a lawyer, is the potential erosion of the rule of law, particularly in the Asia-Pacific region, and here I'm thinking mainly of the South China Sea. I was wondering whether you could highlight the degree of self-reflection that's going on within China after the South China Sea Tribunal decision. Are there differing views in terms of China's position, the position that China has taken in terms of the tribunal's ruling? That's the first question. And the second question really is, would I be correct in saying that although China has soundly condemned the ruling, since the ruling, China has not actually taken any steps that clearly flout the ruling? So I would be very grateful for your elucidation on these points. Thank you.
So I think we've got kind of three sets of questions, and we'll see how that does on time. We're meant to run to about 5:15, so we've got 10 minutes. And maybe we can come back to some more questions. Can we just start at the high level first, which is this question the Fraser asked about a comprehensive approach. Do you feel there's a common enough approach to how to create security across, let's say, the 4 countries that you represent? We've gone through very specific issues like sanctions and whether they can be applied or not. We've talked a bit about the role of military force. But a comprehensive approach implies that countries really need to get involved early and across the whole spectrum. And every country has the spectrum from economic assistance, military training, education, right through to protecting rules of the road. So, Susan, just starting with that one, do you think this word comprehensive approach is being used a lot, but are there debates going on with, that are bilateral with China or with India or other countries in Asia where you're actually discussing or finding opportunities to work together on a comprehensive approach? Are there any examples of success in Africa, in parts of Asia, or is this just not where we are at the moment?
Well, I think a comprehensive approach is still in the future. We're working toward that. And the reason I'm here today is because I'm trying to get everybody more involved in coming up and helping out and addressing global approaches. We heard from Germany a little bit of reticence. We occasionally hear from India and China a bit of reticence on certain issues. I think that reticence, be there as it may, we are seeing this changing, that these countries are taking on a bit of a bigger role, either in the region or on the global stage in particular. We've had a lot of examples recently with China stepping up on the Ebola crisis in Africa, on the Iran nuclear deal, climate change. They're working with us in Afghanistan on trying to push forward reconciliation. So we have had some positive responses, and we work together on pandemics and other things. So I think there is space, and people are stepping up into it, but we are using all kinds of ad hoc formats right now. Yeah. A lot of bilateral work on our part. Certainly we're trying to encourage other countries to take it up bilaterally to the extent possible. And then we have all kinds of other multilateral and minilateral formats. We have a number, to the point about red lines, a number of discussions. I think the two elephants you were talking about were probably the US and China. So this is the approach we're using to manage that as well. We're not drawing lines and making threats and pointing fingers. We're trying to have discussions and work through disagreements we may have, or competition we may have, by talking about it and making sure that we're clear on what our intentions are.
The Americans have been quite good at having ambiguity when they've needed it. I mean, the China-Taiwan relationship has allowed plenty to go on while that ambiguity has been allowed. So sometimes not having red lines is possibly a good thing. Before we get to those other questions, Niels, let me come to you on this. So do you think, I don't want to put Susan on the spot on this, it may be that the United States may not be as available in the next 3 or 4 years to participate with European countries on some big global security challenges, be they in Africa, be they in Asia. And you're chairing the South Asia part of the Foreign Affairs Committee here. Are you collaborating already with Indian government or with Indian NGOs or the Indian military or with its foreign service, its foreign ministry, on areas where you can be testing out comprehensive approaches or new ways of dealing with these challenges? Is anything happening?
Well, we are not a shadow government in our commission.
You might know that. You might be asking the government.
But no, of course. And I think I just today had a meeting with our Deputy Consul General who was serving in Mazar-e Sharif and who was in our consulate building when there was a terrible Taliban attack, and he barely survived that attack. And so Afghanistan is maybe not the central global discussion anymore, but we are trying to, of course, engage with the neighboring countries. We have an interest, and we also have a responsibility, because we have been there for many years now, and we changed some conditions on the ground. We lost 50 soldiers, and we invested a huge amount of money. And I really believe that a stability for Afghanistan and the region can only be achieved if there's an arrangement between India, of course. You mentioned Pakistan, and we also see a problem of terrorism and still sponsoring for terrorism, but also a civil government and a parliament that is open to discussions. And that represents a certain progress, that we don't have a military government anymore. And if I could just mention this, because China is also a neighbor of Afghanistan. There are Chinese investments in Afghanistan, which I believe are in your best interest and in the country's best interest, but I would wish for more engagement
Right.
in that aspect. So this is maybe a tiny example, and I also maybe want to just comment to the comment the gentleman there made. I agree. I think the Asia-Pacific region has been a source of inspiration for us, and we also need to say that with the concerns I raised about arms races, about territorial disputes, and also in some countries growing nationalism and extremism, I'm not afraid of immediate turmoil or major war. And I think what China achieved was probably the most successful program in history to fight poverty. And we benefited from that. But we also see with some concern that it's getting more difficult in I would say, a very good and established relationship between our governments on almost every level. On the level of the top leaders, on cabinet level, but also on the level of party exchange, civil society. It's getting more complicated to talk about human rights. It's getting more complicated, for example, to talk about working conditions for our political foundations and other stuff. That's maybe not a global issue, but it's an indicator for a new attitude. And we need to talk about this. And my impression, quite frankly, is a little bit that with all due respect to some of our friends in Europe, we sometimes have the impression that we are more or less the only ones addressing these tricky issues still in Beijing. So things are changing, and does not mean that we are not have huge respect for what China achieved, but there's also some concerns that we need to address, and I hope we can continue addressing this in a way of mutual respect and the relationship that was mutual beneficial, I think, for China as well as for Europe, and it's a relationship that has also a certain global impact.
Thank you, Subrahmanyam. I'm keeping an eye on time here, and I think we've just got 4 or 5 minutes left. So, I mean, there's a pretty direct question that came there. Why haven't China and India been more actively involved, at least in the eyes of the questioner? And maybe we could fold into that your views of the rules of the road. Maybe you feel the rules aren't designed in such a way that India wants to play as much. I mean, how would you answer those two questions?
Well, the first question, the comprehensive question, let me make 3 very quick points. You know, I said terrorism because he asked me what were my big concerns. Yep. Had he asked me what was my big contribution, I would have said pluralism. The fact that I've been able to keep 1/6 of the world calm, quiet in a very difficult world. So he asked me the wrong question. Now,
you gave the right answer in the end, so it was perfect.
My second observation is that, when we look at a comprehensive solution, I think the big question today is how much of a contribution the United States is going to make. If you now look at a situation where the US may do less, there's an appreciation of what the US has been doing all along, which perhaps wasn't there earlier. It's a term which was fashionable in this part of the world, but which might well have to now be applied to Asia, which is burden sharing. Is the future of Asia actually going to involve more burden sharing? And the third quick comment on the first issue is, you asked about what is Asia doing right. I'll also say what is Europe doing right. And one issue where Europe has broadly done right is within Europe, it's got some kind of security architecture and rules in place, which Asia has not. And maybe there's a lesson there for Asia. So that's a quick answer to the first one. On the second one, should India be doing more? I think what India has been doing sometimes is taken for granted. I mean, if you look at something like the UN peacekeeping operation, not now, but over 70 years, and ask yourself, who are the peacekeepers? Exactly. You might get an answer to your question. Or if you today look and see challenges like Yemen, I mean, we went in there to get everybody out of Yemen because nobody else was willing to do that. And I think you'll see more of that. So the point is a valid one. I mean, you may not have fully recognized what we may have done, but if your expectation is we'll do more, I think that expectation would be right.
Dr. you've got the last answer. Maybe you could say what you've been contributing to global security is helping the other 1/6 of the world population keep itself on a growth rate as well as your growing contributions now to the UN. So there's a pattern here between perhaps China and India. But how would you answer some of these questions that were raised here, in particular on the rule of law?
First, why China has not been able to play a greater role in world security. I think that China's role in global security is already growing, fast growing, and sometimes the role has not been recognized because China is not so articulate. China does not speak English. But some facts, China has been contributing to the UN peacekeeping operations, the second largest funder of the peacekeeping operations, one of the largest contributor to forces, and China had been sending 30,000 peacekeepers, and at any time now, China has 3,000 peacekeepers on UN security, on UN missions all over the world, not all over the world, but and also China has been doing something in Afghanistan quite a lot. China is part of the Istanbul process. China has set up or promoted the four-country regime or mechanism among the militaries of four countries, China, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Tajikistan, to have very frequent consultations on information sharing, training, and also a database setting. So I think that China should be more articulate. That's to have the world know that China is taking and is already quite in the global security landscape. So when I had the topic of this panel, getting Asia in, I feel a little bit uncomfortable because Asia is already in. So, and the second thing is that China is growing so fast that China sometimes don't feel comfortable with itself. China has to learn how to take the responsibilities, to learn how to be a regional and global player. And this is another reason that China sometimes is cautious not to take too much responsibilities. And this last thing is also very important, that China has to feel welcome when it tries to play a bigger role in global landscape. And as for the rule-based order in South China Sea, I have to say something. The arbitration case, China has opted not to accept arbitration by a written statement which China sent to the Secretary General of UN, stating that China is not going to accept any arbitration concerning territory delimitation. So that's according to Article 298 of UNCLOS. That's rule-based behavior. Okay.
This could go on, but it mustn't, because we are 5 minutes over and every other panel's been on time. So I'm afraid we have to stop the panel there. But I think there's an interesting dynamic between the way the UN is actually providing a vehicle for so many other countries to want to be engaged in contributing to security. One might argue after a 30-year period or 40-year period of US leadership. But then, of course, those countries discovering, like America did, that in that UN system, there are restrictions as well. And just as the US has looked for flexibility in the UN system, and it has, China and India will look for flexibility in the UN system. That wouldn't surprise me. Where that leaves Europe, of course, which quite likes following the rules, we'll have to wait and see.
thank you, Robin. Thank you very much. Secretary Jaishankar, I know that you have to run off, so please feel free to leave the stage. It's totally fine. You have another appointment to catch. I thank the entire panel. For what has been a discussion taking us out of the European bubble for a moment, and what Secretary Jaishankar called the differentiated West. I think that was a good term that might lead us to the next panel that we're looking at for our last panel, which will re-adjourn at 5:30 when we start for the final discussion on US foreign policy after the elections. And now for the coffee break.